Hello, everybody. Tim Hughes here. I'm the CEO and co-founder of DLA Ignite. With me today, I've got Lee Chambers, and we're going to be talking about male allyship. What is it? What is inclusion? What is diversity? How is that changing? Before I'm going to ask you that question about where people can find you, Lee, I'm going to mention your book. We're not talking about it today, but Lee has a new book out. And I thought I'd get a plug in for it. Momentum, 13 Ways to Unlock Your Potential. It's just out. Mine arrived today, only about 2 hours ago. The ink isn't dry yet. Lee, where can people find you?
So the best places to find me are at leechambers.org and on LinkedIn, where if you type in Lee Chambers, I'm highly likely to be the first thing that pops up on your feed.
So just before we went live on this, I pointed out that I went out for a meal last night. I had a Chinese and I met some friends. And I mentioned at the end about my podcast, and I said I was meeting you today. And I was going to talk about male allyship. And they all looked at me as if I was completely out of my head. So what is it?
Probably the best way to describe it is to think about where the word allyship comes from. What's the root of the word? The root of the word is the old French word allier, which means to combine, to unite, and to come together. So if we think about what male allyship is the concept of men coming together, uniting with all sorts of different people to actually make change in the world, especially because if we look at society as it is today, male loneliness, male disconnection, male kind of self-sufficiency.
Suicide.
The social indicators are not going the right way. And a big core of that is the fact that we're a very social species. We always have been, yet we've been sold this dream of kind of independence, self-sufficiency, which ultimately means we're disconnected from each other. And we've lost that brotherhood, we've lost that unity. And a big part of the work that we do is how do men connect to themselves and others? And what role does that play in being included in the workplace in a different way than they historically have been as well?
Because I think that there's some stat, isn't there, that even though we're now even more social, we're also more lonely than we were before. So what are the common challenges for men?
Yeah, so if I kind of think about my work, which ranges from, men all the way through to boys in education, like I said, social indicators, whether it's life satisfaction, life expectancy, addiction, suicide, educational attainment, loneliness, mental health, we're all going in the wrong direction for men and boys in the Western world, and that is not a good thing. Fundamentally, we're trying to fit a set of gender norms, the way that masculinity should be, the way that we're told it should be, but actually that can quite often stop us from being who we are and actually make us want to become very individualistic in how we develop ourselves. And that in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. But the collective change and purpose that we often have, especially when we come into the workplace, workplaces are very rarely a workplace of one. There's lots of kind of self-employed and people who do take that pathway to work as a consultant or something where they have a relative level of control. But still, they will work with businesses and entities that are hundreds, thousands of people. So as a species, we have always been very, very pro-social, more so than any other primate species that are our kind of brothers and cousins in many ways. Yet we've got to a point where we've almost socialized that out of ourselves, and we've got a lot of fear. We're scared of difference. We've become like passive when it comes to connecting with other people. And the art of conversation is gradually being lost. And that in itself is quite scary because that's what makes us wonderfully human. And the deeper we can go as humans, the more we can truly kind of pull on our amazing abilities and understand who we are. And I think that in some ways, being able to be open about those challenges and to get people connecting to think about the difference they can make. Because as humans, one of the biggest things that we have is we're all unique, we're all different. And when we bring that together in a space to create things through that difference, we make better decisions. We're able to solve really complex problems. We're able to tackle the challenges we have as a species. But at the minute, we're not connecting in that way. So for me, it's about how do we actually create connection in a world where people are almost repelled from each other? And how do we create more trust and more spaces to get curious and explore in a world where people want to be safe and secure and very comfortable? Because all this kind of innovation that we've seen, a lot of it's driven by trying to make things very instantly gratifying, very comfortable, and very kind of easy. But we all know fast food doesn't really nourish us like a good hearty meal.
And I know that when we talked in the preparation call, you talked very much about how males, especially young males, were being sold an image. So just like in the past, females were sold this image that was which was propagated in magazines like Elle and and even Red or magazines like that. We're now getting this male image that's being that basically what we've got to do is we've all got to go down the gym and get big muscles and stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because it wasn't that long ago we had 4 TV channels, 10 magazines, 10 newspapers, a few thousand books, and that was everything we had access to, apart from the things in our real lives, our kind of tangible world of our parents and our friends' parents and our aunties and uncles, as examples, as role models, as kind of guides and mentors. Now people can swipe up on the mobile phone and they've got access to millions of different perspectives. But those perspectives still to this day don't have, it's liberated. Everyone can broadcast their version of the news, their version of the truth. And how do young people navigate the complexities of that when it's very hard now to find where the original source of information has come from? It's been replicated, Chinese whispers across hundreds of different internet influencers to a point where the message gets to someone. But if someone's got 1 million followers, surely there can be a reputable, truthful source of information. Sadly, that's not the reality. But for young people, they are in a world where they are kind of marketed to. Young boys are marketed to by online influencers, by forum moderators, by video game streamers, not by brands that have to abide by advertising standards, not by brands that if their adverts weren't telling the truth, they'd get pulled from the television or the magazine, but by people where there is really no moderation of what they say. And that's incredibly difficult because they're surrounded by all these different polarizing voices. Who do you believe? And we know that for many young boys, I work in schools with 11 to 16-year-olds, 50% of them feel their online world is more interesting, more engaging, and more rewarding than real life. And that means the online world is going to be their source of information, their source of belonging, their source of people who understand and who listen, and a place where they can feel connected to something. But that also means they're vulnerable in those spaces to having their beliefs and perspectives shaped in a way that is beneficial to the people who own the community, to effectively turn them into consumers of the future, whether that's their online courses, their products, we've seen lots of young people running around to get an Illuminous soft drink because 2 influencers said it was the next best thing. And then all of a sudden, shops are selling out, and very kind of entrepreneurial young children are selling bottles for £20
on eBay. Yeah.
Now it's in your local discount store for about 70p.
Yeah.
But it just shows the power of those individuals to influence consumption. And young men 18 to 24 are the only group in research where meat eating is actually increasing. Every other demographic, it's decreasing, naturally because of the more sustainable and conscious world we're in. But in that group, the power of carnivore influencers, keto influencers mean that they're the only group who's been influenced to eat more meat. And that just shows the power of the internet. And not all those communities are on the platforms that we as adults think about. I speak to young people and they're like, TikTok, yeah, that's got moderation. And Andrew Tate, well, people were talking about him 4 years ago. He's got arrested numerous times. He's a criminal. We don't care about him anymore. But actually, what are adults not noticing? The Discord groups, the Telegram groups, the Amino communities, the Omegle, connections, like these places where we now hang out, that are not on social media because they're not front facing. Unless you're a member of the group, you can't even see what's being talked about or shared in here. So it is a very different world to navigating in, and it's very difficult for educators in schools, for parents, and for adults to navigate and understand the world that their children are in, which can make it quite a challenge to kind of connect with them. And we all know, we all go through that adolescent period as kind of teenagers, where our parents just seem to always be telling us off, and we're much more likely to listen to our peers than we are our parents. And then we kind of grow up and come back again to our parents, and suddenly we realize they were probably quite wise. But so many young lads are going through that period and looking for boyhood personal development. How do I get bigger muscles? How do I talk to girls? How do I get a good job in the future? What skills do I need right now? My parents are divorced. What do I do? They look to the online world for some support, and they can land on stuff that's really beneficial, or they can land on stuff that actually takes them on a bit of a reductive journey. And yeah, that's why our work in schools is, really kind of pivotal to what we do. And that work is funded by our work in the corporate space.
So going back to the corporate world, how can male leaders foster a more inclusive culture that supports all people?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have to kind of take a minute to just appreciate that the typical workplace is very, very male normative by design. And it wasn't that long ago, when in times when we were born, there wasn't a massive population of women in the workplace in the way that there is today. It's been a massive shift over the past, 60 years. And that means that many organizations were created back then. And the pillars, the fundamentals are based around workplaces being, groups of men competing against each other, creating commercial outcomes, selling things, innovating and coming up with great ideas. But it naturally is very male centric. You think about the language of leadership, so much of it is very been pulled from the military. Everything from firm and company to on the front lines, battlefield, ammunition, competition, chain of command, hierarchy. These are all military terms. So the whole way of leading, the whole way of operating in business is very kind of male by nature. And just a bit of mindfulness around actually how do we role model a type of leadership that is a bit more balanced. I think that sometimes people say, oh, well, like we need to all become a bit more female in our leadership. And I think that people need to become more themselves beyond the gender stereotypes that exist and find a way to actually turn up as an authentic leader to who you are as a leader. Now, that's a journey because you need to unpack lots of the conditioning and become more self-aware of how you turn up, become a bit more connected to the other humans around you. And if we're able to actually be the leaders who we are, that will actually mean that the leaders across a whole, institution are bringing their unique difference to leadership, which widens the perspective of many leaders being very similar to the leaders that led them. And actually thinking about how will I turn up and lead in a world where I've got more permission to lead in the way that aligns with my values, and that fundamentally is an expression of who I am, while also flexing that to be able to lead a whole range of different people around them. And I do feel that if people are able to lead in alignment with themselves, it gives people on that leadership journey a vision that they can also really start to understand themselves, and that leadership isn't just a title, it's a way of being. And actually it's not just something that you're assigned. And ultimately, even if you don't have a title that says leader within it, we all lead ourselves every single day. And many of us are leaders outside of the corporate world, whether it be in the things we volunteer, our hobbies, of our families and our kind of, communities. So yeah, I think so much of it is that kind of self-reflection and that work on ourselves that we should all technically be doing, because we're the biggest experiment we'll ever have in our lives is really understanding and exploring ourselves. And as we get that bit wiser, we get more keys to unlock the things within ourselves that we previously couldn't access to. So yeah, no, it's to be honest, Tim, it's a part of all our journeys to really start to get closer to who we are. And I think that does involve a lot of reflection and some of that self-work.
I think that, and if you think about the way that business has been set up, the leaders of today were looking to the people that were leading 10, 20, 30 years ago and saying, so what does leadership mean? Oh, it means this. So they're bringing those things. And I think, as Katie Duckworth has said, she's nodding along, and I agree with you. There needs to be we need to come with ourselves. I want to ask you though about unconscious bias. What's the position of and how does that play in the way that we work?
Yeah, so I mean, I've got two perspectives on this, Tim, as I do with most things. So firstly, we do have a level of unconscious bias, things we just simply don't notice, those kind of default patterns. But as humans, we have over 200 different biases. Now, the truth is we all have those biases. This idea that we can remove all bias, if we didn't have any of those biases, we'd be dead. Those biases shortcut a lot of cognitive processing so that we've got time to focus on sleeping and eating and doing the things that keep us alive. So sometimes we glorify this idea of removing all bias, and wouldn't we be so wise and so sage? No, we'd be dead. So there is an aspect of, considering that actually we do have bias and we will always have bias, and to eradicate all bias is simply idealistic and not realistic. I think on the other side is, there is a time when awareness has increased where actually you start to question how much of that bias is potentially unconscious and how much of it sometimes is just being lazy with assumptions, where actually we could get a bit more curious and a bit more nuanced about things. And I think historically, unconscious bias training hasn't been particularly helpful. It does kind of highlight things and make people think, maybe I didn't notice that or see that before. But it rarely turns into any sustained action. And that's why I'm very much focused on allyship as a concept, because allyship is active inclusion. What are the kind of the small little things that we can do to build a skill of being actively and intentionally inclusive? Because even unconscious bias suggests that it's something that, well, you can't really notice it. So it's not really on you to actively and intentionally work on that skill. It can be a little bit apologetic for people. But also, unconscious bias training sometimes is delivered in a very smack people around the back of the head, you should be better type way. And that's not helpful either, because I believe historically, some of that kind of batting people around the head with a stick saying they need to be better has created some of the very resistance towards inclusion that we have today.
I gave you an example. I won't mention the organisation, but quite recently, just before Christmas, an organisation said to me, we're not taking any white males on at the moment. We're only taking on females.
And to be honest, you have to take a step back and ask why. Because are they trying to kind of work in a really binary way to meet a ratio? It's like, I understand that there's a level of action that needs to be taken to reduce barriers for certain groups. So what they should be doing is looking at the hiring process and thinking, okay, how can we make this more equitable, more fair, so we get more females applying? But then that needs to go through an inclusive recruitment process. To just completely say one demographic is kind of not able to apply, that's exclusionary. Like that, it just, and then how can you say it's part of an inclusive process when it's fundamentally excluding a group of people? So there are ways to do this work in a way that's thinking about how to reduce the resistance for the individuals who you're looking potentially to attract more of. And what does that say about how the organization is inside of the organization? They're going to take on exclusively one group. Are they working on making sure it's an inclusive workplace to work? A place where those groups can be respected and listened to? Because the people who are hired on that basis are going to be looked at with a level of suspicion. Because if other people in the business hear that that's what's working, they're going to think those people have been hired because of their identity, not because of the skills. They're always going to be under that level of suspicion. And it might mean that actually the culture itself isn't very equitable or inclusive, and those people will leave, meaning it only exacerbates the issues around imbalance. It doesn't help create a better internal balance to ensure that people from different characteristics are, more likely to be retained and more likely to bring the talents. So no, Tim, I'm not a fan of reductive ways of trying to make things more diverse without focusing on the inclusive. Really, inclusion and allyship come first.
Lee, the 20 minutes goes very, very quickly. I could talk to you about this subject for at least an hour, but I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm just going to put your book up, Momentum, 13 Ways to Unlock Your Potential. I've not read it. It arrived today, but I'm going to wave it in the air and maybe sell a few copies for you. Lee, where can people find you?
So again, it's at leechambers.org or Lee Chambers on LinkedIn, where I post things that will probably make you think and reflect most days.
Lee is I would say Lee is a great person to follow, because as he says, you will read it and go, oh yeah, I never thought about that. And don't we need some of that in our lives sometimes?